In the ancient world, where gods walked among mortals and heroes carved their names into eternal legend, there lived a warrior whose very name would echo through the corridors of time for thousands of years. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed and allow your mind to drift toward peaceful sleep, let me tell you the complete story of Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, whose tale of glory, rage, love, and ultimate tragedy remains one of the most powerful narratives ever told. This is not just another bedtime story. This is the epic saga of a man who was both blessed and cursed by the gods themselves, a hero who would face an impossible choice between a long-forgotten life and a short existence blazing with immortal glory. As your breathing deepens and your thoughts begin to slow, allow yourself to be transported back over 3,000 years to the Bronze Age shores of ancient Greece, where the line between mortal and divine was razor thin, and where a single warrior's wrath would determine the fate of kingdoms. The story I'm about to share with you spans decades, from Achilles' supernatural birth to his legendary death at the gates of Troy. You'll witness his transformation from a young prince learning the arts of war to becoming the most feared warrior on any battlefield. You'll experience his deep friendship with Patroclus, his complex relationship with the gods who both protected and tormented him, and ultimately his choice to embrace a destiny that would make him immortal in memory while destroying him in life. So close your eyes, let your body relax completely, and prepare to journey into a world where bronze spears clash against bronze shields, where divine intervention shapes the course of human events, and where one man's incredible story illuminates the very essence of what it means to be heroic. This is the story of Achilles, son of Peleus, beloved of the gods, terror of his enemies, and the greatest warrior the world has ever known. Our tale begins not with Achilles himself, but with his mother, the sea nymph Thetis, whose own story would shape every moment of her son's extraordinary life. Thetis was no ordinary immortal being. She was one of the 50 Nereids, daughters of the ancient sea god Nereus, and her beauty was so legendary that it caught the attention of the most powerful gods in the pantheon. Both Zeus, king of the gods, and Poseidon, lord of the seas, desired her as their bride, competing for her affections with the intensity that shook the foundations of Olympus itself. But the fates had woven a prophecy around Thetis that would change everything. The ancient oracle had declared that any son born to Thetis would grow to become greater than his father, more powerful, more renowned, destined to surpass even the mightiest of gods. When Zeus learned of this prophecy, his desire for Thetis transformed instantly into fear. The king of the gods understood that if he married the sea nymph and fathered a child with her, that child would one day overthrow him, just as Zeus himself had overthrown his own father, Kronos, in ages past. Faced with this terrifying possibility, Zeus made a decision that would echo through generations. Rather than risk his own divine authority, he arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal man, ensuring that her prophesied son would be merely human, limited by mortality, despite his destined greatness. The mortal chosen for this honor was Peleus, king of the Myrmidons in Thessaly, a noble warrior known throughout Greece for his courage, wisdom, and just rule. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis became one of the most magnificent celebrations in ancient history. Gods and mortals alike gathered to witness this unprecedented union between divine and human. The ceremony took place on Mount Pelion, where centaurs roamed, and the very air seemed thick with magic and possibility. Divine gifts poured forth from the assembled gods. Poseidon presented magnificent horses that could run faster than the wind itself. Athena offered weapons forged by divine smiths that would never break in battle. Apollo granted the gift of prophecy and healing. But even in this moment of celebration, the seeds of future tragedy were being sown. Eris, the goddess of discord, had not been invited to the wedding, and her fury at this slight would eventually lead to the Trojan War itself. In her rage, she threw a golden apple inscribed with the words, "For the fairest," among the wedding guests, sparking the divine beauty contest between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite that would ultimately result in Paris of Troy's fateful judgment and the abduction of Helen. However, that night belonged to celebration and joy. As the divine and mortal guests feasted and danced, Thetis and Peleus were blessed by the gods with promises of a child who would surpass all mortal warriors in strength, courage, and renown. The prophecy remained intact, but now safely contained within mortal limitations, or so the gods believed. When Achilles was born, Thetis gazed upon her infant son with a mixture of overwhelming love and heartbreaking sorrow. She could see the threads of fate woven around him, the glory that awaited, but also the brevity of the life that would contain it. Her divine nature allowed her to perceive what mortal mothers could not, the exact shape of her child's destiny. She knew that her son would become the greatest warrior who ever lived, but she also knew that his life would be cut short in the prime of his youth. Determined to alter her son's fate, Thetis embarked on a desperate attempt to grant him immortality. Each night, while her mortal husband slept, she would take the infant Achilles to the sacred fire and hold him over the flames, burning away his mortal flesh bit by bit and replacing it with divine essence. During the day, she would anoint his body with ambrosia, the food of the gods, strengthening the divine transformation taking place within him. This process was agonizing for both mother and child, but Thetis persevered, knowing that if she could complete the transformation, her son would be forever beyond the reach of death. Night after night, she continued the ritual, watching as her baby's mortal nature gradually gave way to something approaching true divinity. The transformation was nearly complete when tragedy struck. One night, King Peleus awakened to find his wife holding their infant son over the fire. Unable to see the divine magic at work, knowing nothing of the immortality being forged through sacred flame, he saw only what appeared to be an attempt to murder their child. His anguished cry shattered the night, and he leaped forward to rescue Achilles from what he perceived as certain death. The interruption destroyed everything. The delicate process of divine transformation was broken at the crucial moment, leaving Achilles caught between mortality and immortality. Thetis, heartbroken and furious at her husband's interference, realized that her son would now face his destined fate with no protection from death itself. In her rage and grief, she abandoned her mortal family, returning to her father's kingdom beneath the waves, leaving Peleus to raise their son alone. The infant Achilles survived the interrupted transformation, but he bore its mark for the rest of his life. His body had been strengthened far beyond normal human limits, granted speed and power that no ordinary mortal could match. His skin had become tough as bronze, nearly impervious to ordinary weapons. But one small part of his body had remained untouched by the divine fire, the heel by which his mother had held him during the transformation ritual, and this spot remained perfectly mortal, perfectly vulnerable. As Achilles grew from infant to child, his extraordinary nature became increasingly apparent. He ran faster than boys twice his age, showed strength that seemed impossible for his small frame, and demonstrated a natural mastery of combat that amazed even experienced warriors. By the age of 6, he could outfight grown men. By 9, he was hunting wild boars and lions single-handedly. His father Peleus watched this development with a mixture of pride and growing concern, understanding that his son was destined for greatness, but also recognizing the dangerous path that lay ahead. Seeking guidance for his extraordinary child's education, Peleus consulted the wisest centaur in all of Greece, Chiron, who lived in a cave on Mount Pelion. Unlike his wild and unruly centaur brothers, Chiron was known throughout the ancient world for his wisdom, his knowledge of medicine, music, and the arts of war, and his skill in training heroes. He had already educated Jason of the Argonauts and many other legendary figures. When Peleus brought young Achilles to Chiron's cave, the centaur immediately recognized the divine spark within the boy. Chiron understood that training such a child would require methods far beyond ordinary instruction. He accepted Achilles as his student, beginning an education that would shape the future hero in ways both wonderful and terrible. Under Chiron's guidance, Achilles learned not just the arts of war, but the deeper wisdom that should accompany great power. The centaur taught him to hunt the fiercest creatures of the mountain forests, to track prey through impossible terrain, and to survive in the wilderness using nothing but his wits and skills. He learned to play the lyre with such beauty that wild animals would gather to listen, to compose poetry that captured the hearts of all who heard it, and to heal wounds using ancient knowledge of herbs and medicine. Most importantly, Chiron taught Achilles the complex codes of honor that governed heroic behavior in the ancient world. He learned that true greatness came not just from victory in battle, but from protecting the innocent, showing mercy to defeated enemies, respecting the gods, and maintaining loyalty to friends and family above all else. These lessons would guide Achilles throughout his life, though they would also create the internal conflicts that would ultimately define his tragic destiny. During these years of training on Mount Pelion, Achilles formed the friendship that would become the most important relationship of his life. Patroclus was a young prince from Olympus who had been sent to Peleus's court after accidentally killing another boy during a dice game. Though slightly older than Achilles, Patroclus possessed a gentler nature that perfectly complemented his friend's fierce intensity. The two boys trained together under Chiron's guidance, and their friendship deepened into something approaching the divine bond that the Greeks called philophilia, a love between companions that transcended ordinary human relationships. Patroclus became Achilles' closest confidant, the only person who could calm his legendary temper, the one individual whose opinion mattered more than glory or divine favor. Where Achilles was quick to anger and swift to action, Patroclus provided wisdom and restraint. Where Patroclus might hesitate in the face of danger, Achilles provided courage and determination. Together, They represented the perfect warrior, combining fierce strength with thoughtful strategy, individual prowess with loyal companionship. As the years passed and both young men approached adulthood, news began to reach even the remote heights of Mount Pelion about growing tensions between Greece and the great city of Troy across the Aegean Sea. Prince Paris of Troy had abducted Helen, wife of King Menelaus of Sparta, sparking outrage throughout the Greek kingdoms. Kings and heroes were gathering, preparing for what would become the greatest war in human history. Chiron watched his two students with growing concern as reports of the gathering storm reached his mountain sanctuary. The wise centaur possessed the gift of prophecy, and when he gazed upon Achilles, he could see the threads of fate growing brighter and more terrible with each passing day. He knew that soon messengers would arrive seeking the young hero, and that once Achilles departed Mount Pelion, the path toward his destined glory and doom would become irreversible. The centaur made a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his immortal existence. Rather than reveal the full extent of what he had foreseen, rather than warn Achilles of the choice that awaited him, Chiron chose to prepare his student as thoroughly as possible for the trials ahead. He intensified their training, teaching Achilles combat techniques that had been passed down through generations of heroes, sharing secrets of warfare that few mortals had ever learned. During these final months on Mount Pelion, Achilles mastered the art of fighting with spear and sword simultaneously, learned to command troops through the chaos of battle, and developed the tactical brilliance that would make him not just a great individual warrior, but a devastating military leader. Patroclus trained alongside him, though both young men understood that his role would be as Achilles' lieutenant and closest advisor, rather than his equal in combat. The peaceful days of their youth were drawing to a close, though neither fully grasped how completely their lives were about to change. They spent their final weeks racing across mountain meadows, competing in contests of strength and skill, sharing stories and dreams of the future that lay ahead. In quiet moments, they would sit together, watching the sunset paint the peaks of Mount Pelion in shades of gold and crimson, neither speaking of the growing certainty that their carefree days were numbered. The messenger arrived on a morning when spring flowers were just beginning to bloom across the mountainside. He was a herald from King Menelaus of Sparta, bearing the formal request for Achilles to join the great expedition against Troy. The message was respectful but urgent, acknowledging the young hero's growing reputation while emphasizing the desperate need for warriors of his caliber in the coming conflict. King Peleus received the messenger in his great hall, with Achilles and Patroclus standing beside him. As the herald spoke of Helen's abduction, of the insult to Greek honor, and of the mighty army gathering at Aulis, Achilles felt something stirring within him that he had never experienced before. It was not fear, for he had never known that emotion. Instead, it was a deep, almost painful longing, as though his very soul was calling out toward the destiny that awaited him across the wine-dark sea. But Peleus, who had lived with the knowledge of his son's fate for nearly 2 decades, was not prepared to let Achilles go so easily. The king knew that once his son departed for Troy, he would never see him alive again. The old warrior had consulted oracles, and wise women had pleaded with the gods for some alternative, but the answer was always the same. Achilles would achieve immortal glory at Troy, but he would pay for that glory with his life. Desperate to protect his son, Peleus devised a plan that he hoped might delay or even prevent Achilles' participation in the war. He had learned that the expedition could not succeed without Achilles, that the fates had woven the young hero so deeply into the coming conflict that victory was impossible without him. Perhaps, the king reasoned, if Achilles were hidden away until the war ended, his son might escape his destined doom. Under cover of darkness, Peleus sent Achilles and Patroclus to the island kingdom of Skyros, ruled by King Lycomedes. The plan was for Achilles to disguise himself among the king's daughters, hidden in plain sight until the danger passed. For a hero whose very essence was bound up in courage and martial glory, this deception represented the deepest possible humiliation. Yet Achilles agreed to his father's plan, not from cowardice, but from love and respect for the men who had raised him. He understood the agony his departure would cause Peleus, and if hiding on Skyros for a few months would give his father peace of mind, he was willing to make that sacrifice. Besides, both young men told themselves, surely the war would be brief, and they would have missed nothing of importance. The deception proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. King Lycomedes welcomed the disguised Achilles into his household, believing him to be a distant cousin seeking refuge from family troubles. The hero was given women's clothing and taught to move and speak like a princess, though his natural bearing made the disguise precarious at best. During his months on Skyros, Achilles formed a relationship with Deidamia, one of Lycomedes' daughters. What began as part of his disguise gradually developed into genuine affection and eventually love. Deidamia was the first woman who had ever captured Achilles' attention, her gentle nature and quick intelligence providing a stark contrast to the world of warfare and violence that had shaped his young life. For a brief time, Achilles allowed himself to imagine a different future. Perhaps he could remain on Skyros, marry Deidamia, and live a peaceful life far from the battlefields that called to him. He could raise children, rule justly, and grow old surrounded by family and friends. It would be a good life, a normal life, the kind of existence that most mortals could only dream of achieving. But even as he played at being an ordinary prince, Achilles could feel his true nature straining against the bonds of his disguise. When he watched the palace guards training in the courtyard, his hands would unconsciously reach for weapons that weren't there. When he heard stories of battles and heroic deeds, his heart would race with an excitement that no peaceful pursuit could match. The warrior within him was growing restless, demanding release. Patroclus, who had remained by his friend's side throughout the deception, could see the internal struggle consuming Achilles. During their private moments together, he would urge his companion to abandon the disguise and embrace his true calling. The war at Troy had begun in earnest, Patroclus argued, and every day they remained hidden was another day that Greek heroes were dying without the aid that only Achilles could provide. The debate between them grew more intense as months passed. Achilles, torn between his desire to protect his father from grief, his growing love for Deidamia, and the inexorable pull of his destined glory. Patroclus, meanwhile, was consumed by his own longing for adventure and his deep belief that they were both wasting their lives in this elaborate charade. The resolution came in a manner neither had anticipated. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca and master of cunning strategies, had been tasked by the other Greek leaders with finding Achilles. Through his network of spies and informants, Odysseus had learned of the young hero's likely location, and he arrived at Skyros with a plan designed to force Achilles to reveal his true identity. Disguising himself as a merchant, Odysseus requested an audience with King Lycomedes, claiming to have brought gifts suitable for the royal daughters. He spread out an array of beautiful jewelry, fine fabrics, and cosmetics, items that would naturally appeal to young women. But hidden among these feminine treasures, he placed a magnificent sword and a bronze-tipped spear, weapons of obvious quality and power. As the princesses gathered around to examine the merchant's wares, Odysseus watched carefully for any sign of unusual interest in the weapons. Most of the young women ignored the sword and spear entirely, focusing instead on the jewelry and silks. But one figure, taller and broader than the others despite the feminine disguise, moved immediately toward the weapons with unmistakable recognition and longing. The moment Achilles' hands closed around the sword's grip, his disguise became meaningless. The way he held the weapon, tested its balance, and examined its craftsmanship revealed his true nature to anyone with knowledge of warfare. Odysseus smiled with satisfaction, knowing that his trap had worked perfectly. But the clever king of Ithaca was not content to rely on this evidence alone. He had brought with him a trumpeter who now sounded the alarm call that signaled an attack on the palace. The effect was immediate and decisive. While the genuine princesses scattered in panic, seeking safety and protection, the disguised Achilles instinctively grabbed the spear and shield, taking up a defensive position to protect the others. Standing there in women's clothing, but wielding weapons with obvious expertise, Achilles could no longer maintain his deception. The greatest warrior of his generation had been revealed through his own heroic instincts, unable to suppress his true nature, even for the sake of safety and concealment. Odysseus stepped forward with a knowing smile, addressing Achilles by his true name and acknowledging the futility of further disguise. The young hero looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing recognition dawning in King Lycomedes' eyes, confusion and hurt in Didamia's expression, and quiet satisfaction in Patroclus' features. The moment of choice had arrived earlier than anyone expected, but it had arrived nonetheless. Achilles could no longer delay or avoid the decision that would determine the entire course of his remaining life. He could admit his true identity and join the expedition to Troy, embracing the glory and death that awaited him there, or he could somehow find a way to maintain his disguise and remain safely hidden on Skyros, accepting a life of obscurity but also of continued existence. As he stood there surrounded by the remnants of his shattered deception, Achilles felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon him with almost physical force. Every moment of his extraordinary life had been leading to this single instant, this choice between safety and glory, between a long-forgotten existence and a brief but immortal legacy. The young hero looked at Didamia, seeing the love and fear warring in her eyes, understanding that she somehow sensed what his decision would mean for their future together. He glanced at Patroclus, reading in his oldest friend's expression both encouragement and the absolute certainty that whatever choice Achilles made, they would face the consequences together. Finally, Achilles turned his gaze to Odysseus, the clever king whose arrival had shattered the peaceful illusion of the past months and forced this moment of reckoning. In that instant, looking into the eyes of the man who would become one of his closest allies in the war ahead, Achilles made the choice that would echo through the ages. He cast aside the feminine garments that had concealed his identity, standing revealed as the warrior he had always been destined to become. The deception was over, the hiding finished. Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, student of Chiron, greatest of all mortal warriors, was ready to embrace his fate. The decision rippled through Achilles like lightning through bronze. As he stood there, no longer hidden behind the facade of feminine disguise, he felt something fundamental shift within his very soul. This was not merely the abandonment of a clever deception, but the acceptance of a destiny that had been written in the stars before his birth. The young hero straightened to his full height, and those present could see the transformation taking place before their eyes. The awkward, disguised princess was gone, replaced by something magnificent and terrible to behold. Odysseus nodded with deep satisfaction, recognizing in that moment why the oracles had declared the war unwinnable without this young man's participation. There was something in Achilles' bearing, something in the way he held himself, that marked him as fundamentally different from other mortals. Even the greatest heroes of their age possessed an essential humanity that kept them grounded to earth. But Achilles seemed to burn with an inner fire that lifted him above ordinary mortal concerns. King Lycomedes watched this transformation with growing unease. He had welcomed what he believed to be a young refugee into his household, never suspecting that he had been harboring the most dangerous warrior of his generation. Now, seeing Achilles revealed in his true nature, the king understood why powerful men might go to extraordinary lengths to hide such a person from the world. This was not someone who could be controlled or contained by ordinary means. Didamia felt her heart breaking as she watched the man she loved become something beyond her reach. She had known, somewhere deep in her heart, that there was something extraordinary about her mysterious suitor. His strength, his bearing, his barely contained energy had all suggested depths that his disguise could not fully conceal. But she had allowed herself to hope that whatever secrets he carried might be overcome by love, that their growing affection might provide an anchor strong enough to hold him to a peaceful life. Now she could see that hope crumbling before her eyes. The way Achilles held the sword, the natural grace with which he had assumed a warrior's stance, the fire that burned in his eyes as he looked toward some distant horizon, all spoke of a nature that could never be satisfied with domestic tranquility. She was losing him to something far more powerful than another woman. She was losing him to glory itself. Patroclus felt a complex mixture of emotions as he watched his dearest friend cast aside the pretense that had protected them both for these many months. Relief was certainly present, for he had grown weary of the deception and longed for the honest pursuit of their true calling. But alongside that relief came a darker awareness, a recognition that their carefree youth was ending forever. Once they departed Skyros for the war at Troy, nothing would ever be simple again. Achilles himself seemed to grow taller and more imposing with each passing moment. The divine blood that flowed through his veins responded to his acceptance of destiny, strengthening muscles that were already beyond mortal limits, sharpening senses that could already perceive things hidden from ordinary men. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. He addressed Odysseus first, acknowledging the clever stratagem that had revealed his identity while expressing no anger at being discovered. There was even a note of gratitude in his words, as though he understood that the king of Ithaca had freed him from a prison of his own making. The deception on Skyros had been necessary for his father's peace of mind, but it had also been slowly crushing something essential within his spirit. The conversation that followed would be remembered by all present for the rest of their lives. Odysseus spoke of the war that was raging across the Aegean, of the mighty walls of Troy that had withstood siege for months without yielding, of the Greek heroes who had already fallen in battle against Trojan champions. But more than that, he painted a picture of the glory that awaited those brave enough to win it, the immortal fame that would be earned by the warriors who brought down the greatest city in the world. As Odysseus spoke, Achilles felt something awakening within him that had been dormant during his months of hiding. It was not bloodlust or simple desire for violence, but something far more complex and profound. It was the recognition of his true purpose, the understanding that he had been shaped by gods and fate for this exact moment, this specific destiny. Every lesson learned from Chiron, every hour spent mastering the arts of war, every divine gift inherited from his immortal mother had been preparation for the trials that awaited him at Troy. The young hero began to ask questions that revealed both his tactical brilliance and his deep understanding of what the war truly meant. He inquired about the strength of the Trojan forces, the quality of their leadership, the nature of their defenses. But he also asked about the Greek commanders, wanting to understand the men he would be fighting alongside, their strengths and weaknesses, their methods of warfare. Odysseus answered each question with growing respect for the young man's intelligence. It became clear that Achilles possessed not just supernatural physical abilities, but also a strategic mind that could grasp the complexities of large-scale warfare. This was not merely a weapon to be pointed at the enemy, but a complete military leader who could shape the course of the entire conflict. As they talked deep into the night, the terms of Achilles' participation began to take shape. He would bring with him his own forces, the Myrmidons who had served his father Peleus with legendary loyalty. These warriors, already renowned throughout Greece for their discipline and effectiveness, would be transformed under Achilles' leadership into something approaching an unstoppable military force. But Achilles also made clear that his participation would come with conditions. He would serve the Greek cause, but he would not subordinate himself completely to the authority of Agamemnon, the overall commander of the expedition. The young hero's divine heritage and supernatural abilities placed him in a category apart from ordinary mortals, even other kings and heroes, and he expected to be treated accordingly. More importantly, Patroclus would accompany him as his closest lieutenant and advisor. The two friends were inseparable, their bond forged through years of shared training and mutual understanding. Achilles made it clear that any attempt to separate them would result in his immediate withdrawal from the campaign, regardless of the consequences for the Greek cause. Odysseus readily agreed to these terms, understanding that securing Achilles' participation was worth almost any concession. The oracles had been unanimous in their pronouncements. Without Achilles, Troy would never fall. With him, victory was assured, though the cost would be terrible for all involved. As dawn approached, the practical arrangements for departure began to take shape. Achilles would need time to gather his forces, to prepare his ships, and to make his farewells. But more than that, he needed time to come to terms with what he was leaving behind and what he was embracing. His final conversation with Deidamia took place in the palace gardens as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. She had known this moment would come, had sensed from their earliest meetings that he was not destined for a quiet life on Skyros. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were entirely different things. They spoke of love and duty, of dreams abandoned and destinies accepted. Deidamia did not attempt to dissuade him from his chosen path, understanding that such efforts would be both futile and unfair. Instead, she tried to memorize every detail of his face, every inflection of his voice, knowing that she might never see him again. Achilles, for his part, struggled with emotions that seemed to tear him in different directions. His love for Deidamia was real and deep, offering a glimpse of the peaceful life he might have lived if the gods had woven different threads into his fate. But that same fate called to him with a voice that could not be ignored, promising glories that would echo through the ages long after his mortal body had returned to dust. When they parted, both understood that they were saying goodbye, not just to each other, but to the people they had been during their months together. Achilles would leave Skyros as the greatest warrior of his generation, bound for immortal glory at Troy. Deidamia would remain as a princess who had loved a hero, carrying within her heart memories of what might have been. The ships that would carry Achilles and his Myrmidons to Troy were already being prepared when he sent word to his father's kingdom. The message that reached King Peleus was brief but definitive. His son had been discovered, had accepted his destiny, and was preparing to join the great expedition. The old king read these words with a heart heavy with sorrow, understanding that his worst fears were being realized. Peleus had spent nearly 20 years trying to find some way to alter his son's fate, consulting oracles, making sacrifices to the gods, even attempting to negotiate directly with the powers that controlled destiny itself. But every effort had met with the same response. Achilles was bound to his fate as surely as the sun was bound to rise each morning. The only choice was between accepting that destiny or watching it unfold regardless of anyone's wishes. The gathering of the Myrmidons took place with ceremonial precision that reflected both their military discipline and their deep loyalty to their prince. These were not ordinary soldiers, but elite warriors who had been trained from childhood in the arts of war. They had served Peleus faithfully for decades, and now they would transfer that loyalty to his son, following Achilles wherever his destiny might lead. As the Myrmidon forces assembled, their reputation spread throughout the Greek world. Other heroes who had already committed to the Trojan expedition began to speak of Achilles with a mixture of anticipation and concern. His participation virtually guaranteed victory, but it also introduced an element of unpredictability that made seasoned commanders nervous. The young hero's divine heritage set him apart from even the greatest mortal warriors. His strength, speed, and combat skills exceeded anything previously seen on any battlefield. But more than his physical abilities, there was something in his nature that seemed to burn with an intensity that could inspire his allies or terrify his enemies. Stories began to circulate about Achilles' training under Chiron, his mastery of weapons that few men could even lift, his ability to run faster than horses and strike with the force of thunderbolts. Some of these tales were doubtless exaggerated, but enough truth lay beneath the embellishments to mark him as genuinely extraordinary. Patroclus worked alongside his friend during these preparations, helping to organize supplies, coordinate with ship captains, and manage the countless details involved in moving a military force across the sea. But he also served as Achilles' closest advisor, the one person whose counsel the young hero valued above all others. Their friendship had deepened during their months on Skyros, tested by the stresses of deception and strengthened by shared understanding of what lay ahead. Patroclus understood better than anyone the internal struggles that consumed his friend, the tension between Achilles' desire for glory and his recognition of the price that glory would demand. As the day of departure approached, both young men found themselves reflecting on the path that had brought them to this moment. Their childhood on Mount Pelion seemed like something from another lifetime, a period of innocence that could never be recaptured. The lessons learned from Chiron, the bond forged between them, the gradual awakening of their true natures, all had been preparation for this moment when they would leave safety behind and embrace the unknown dangers of war. The final preparations were completed under skies that seemed to mirror the momentous nature of the occasion. Storms gathered on the horizon, then dissipated as if the gods themselves were uncertain about what was to come. The ships rode at anchor in the harbor, their black hulls gleaming with fresh pitch, their sails furled but ready for the winds that would carry them toward Troy. On the night before departure, Achilles stood alone on the cliffs overlooking the harbor, gazing out across the wine-dark sea toward the distant shores where his destiny awaited. The wind carried the scent of salt and distant storms, and in its voice he could almost hear the clash of bronze on bronze, the cries of warriors in battle, the songs that would celebrate his deeds in ages yet to come. Behind him lay everything he had ever known, the peaceful life he might have lived, the love he was abandoning, the father who would grieve for him. Ahead lay glory beyond imagination, battles that would test every skill he possessed, and ultimately the death that would purchase his immortal fame. As he stood there contemplating the choice he had made, Achilles felt no regret, only a deep sense of rightness, as though all the scattered pieces of his life were finally falling into their proper arrangement. This was what he had been born for, what every moment of his existence had been preparing him to face. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, and in their cold light the young hero saw reflected his own nature, burning bright and brief, destined to blaze across the darkness before fading into legend. Tomorrow he would set sail for Troy, carrying with him the hopes of the Greek forces and the weight of his own magnificent destiny. The greatest warrior who ever lived was ready to embrace his fate. The morning of departure dawned clear and bright, as though the gods themselves had blessed the undertaking that would reshape the ancient world. Achilles stood on the deck of his flagship, watching as the Myrmidon warriors filed aboard with the disciplined precision that had made them legendary throughout Greece. Each man carried his bronze-tipped spear and figure-8 shield, their armor gleaming in the early sunlight like the scales of some great sea serpent preparing to strike. The ships themselves were marvels of ancient craftsmanship, their sleek black hulls designed for both speed and the transport of fighting men. The largest vessel bore carved images of sea nymphs along its prow, a tribute to Thetis and a reminder of the divine blood that flowed through their commander's veins. 50 oars per ship would drive them across the Aegean, while their square sails would catch whatever favorable winds the gods might provide. As the final preparations were completed, Achilles felt the weight of command settling upon his shoulders like a familiar cloak. These men would follow him into battle, trust his judgment in the chaos of warfare, depend upon his leadership to bring them victory and an honor. The responsibility was immense, but it felt natural, as though he had been shaped by fate itself to bear exactly this burden. Patroclus moved among the warriors, checking equipment and offering quiet words of encouragement. His presence brought a sense of calm stability that perfectly complemented Achilles' fierce energy. Where the young hero burned with divine fire, his closest friend provided the steady flame that would keep their forces unified and focused on their ultimate goal. The departure from Skyros took place without elaborate ceremony, but with a solemnity that reflected the magnitude of their undertaking. King Lycomedes stood on the harbor walls with his daughters, watching as the ships prepared to sail. Deidamia remained apart from the others, her face composed but her eyes reflecting the depth of her loss. She had chosen not to come closer, understanding that farewells had already been said, and that prolonging the moment would serve no purpose. As the anchors were raised and the oars bit into the wine-dark water, Achilles stood at the stern of his flagship, his gaze fixed not on what he was leaving behind, but on the horizon that beckoned ahead. The prophecy that had shaped his entire existence was finally beginning to unfold in earnest. The choice between a long, obscure life and brief, immortal glory had been made, and there could be no turning back. The Myrmidon fleet moved out of the harbor in perfect formation, their disciplined rowing creating a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of some great cosmic heart. Other ships would join them at the rendezvous point, adding their strength to the greatest military expedition the world had ever seen. But for now, Achilles sailed alone with his chosen warriors, carrying within his breast the fire that would ultimately bring down the mighty walls of Troy. The voyage across the Aegean was marked by favorable winds and calm seas, as though Poseidon himself approved of their mission. During the long hours of sailing, Achilles moved among his men, learning their names, understanding their individual strengths, forging the bonds of loyalty and mutual respect that would prove essential in the battles ahead. These were not mere soldiers to be commanded, but partners in the greatest enterprise of their age. The Myrmidons had served his father with distinction for decades, but they quickly came to understand that serving the sun would be an entirely different experience. Where Peleus had been a wise and cautious ruler, Achilles burned with an intensity that seemed to transform everyone around him. His very presence on deck made ordinary men feel capable of extraordinary deeds, as though his divine nature somehow elevated those who fought beside him. Stories began to spread among the crew about their young commander's incredible abilities. They had seen him demonstrate feats of strength and speed that defied normal human limitations. During practice sessions on deck, he could catch spears thrown by multiple opponents simultaneously, his movements so fluid and precise that they seemed almost like a deadly dance choreographed by the gods themselves. But more impressive than his physical prowess was the tactical brilliance he displayed when discussing the challenges that awaited them at Troy. Achilles understood warfare not just as individual combat between heroes, but as a complex interaction of forces that required careful coordination and strategic thinking. His plans for the siege showed a maturity and sophistication that amazed even veteran commanders among his followers. As they sailed toward their rendezvous with the main Greek fleet, Achilles spent countless hours in deep conversation with Patroclus, refining their understanding of what lay ahead. They discussed the legendary defenses of Troy, the skill of Trojan warriors, the complex political relationships among the Greek commanders. Every detail mattered, for they understood that success would depend not just on individual heroism, but on their ability to function effectively within the larger Greek force. The reunion with the main expedition took place at the island of Tenedos, within sight of the Trojan coast. The harbor was filled with hundreds of ships from every corner of the Greek world, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope that spoke of the enormous scale of the undertaking. Kings and heroes who had become legends in their own right commanded these vessels, each bringing their own forces and their own ambitions to the collective enterprise. Agamemnon, overall commander of the expedition, received Achilles aboard his flagship with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The king of Mycenae understood better than anyone that victory was impossible without the young hero's participation, but he also recognized the potential for conflict between his own authority and Achilles' divine heritage and supernatural abilities. The meeting between these two powerful men set the tone for much of what would follow at Troy. Agamemnon possessed the political authority and organizational skills necessary to hold the Greek alliance together, but he lacked the personal charisma and military genius that marked true greatness. Achilles embodied everything that Agamemnon wished to be but could never achieve, and this fundamental inequality created tensions that would eventually prove catastrophic. Despite these underlying conflicts, the immediate business of planning the assault on Troy proceeded with impressive efficiency. The combined Greek forces represented the greatest concentration of military power ever assembled, with warriors drawn from every kingdom and island in the Aegean. Their ships darkened the sea for miles in every direction, while their campfires at night created a constellation of light that could be seen from the walls of Troy itself. Among the assembled heroes, Achilles quickly established himself as primus inter pares, first among equals. His youth might have counted against him in normal circumstances, but his divine heritage and obvious capabilities made such considerations irrelevant. Veterans who had been fighting battles before Achilles was born found themselves deferring to his tactical insights and strategic vision. The final approach to the Trojan coast was conducted with military precision that reflected months of careful planning. The Greek fleet moved in coordinated waves, with advanced scouts ensuring that the beaches were suitable for landing and establishing a secure perimeter. The Trojans, watching from their mighty walls, could see the scope of the force arrayed against them, understanding for the first time the true magnitude of the threat they faced. Achilles led the assault on the beaches personally, his bronze armor gleaming in the morning sun as he leapt from his ship into the shallow water. His war cry echoed across the strand, inspiring his own men while striking fear into the hearts of any Trojan defenders. The sight of him advancing up the beach, spear in hand and shield ready, created an image that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come. The establishment of the Greek camp proceeded with remarkable speed and organization. Within days, a virtual city had sprung up on the Trojan plain, complete with defensive walls, supply depots, and administrative centers. The various Greek contingents established their own quarters while maintaining the unity necessary for effective military action. Achilles chose a position for the Myrmidon camp that reflected both tactical considerations and his own somewhat independent status within the Greek alliance. Close enough to coordinate with other forces when necessary, but far enough away to maintain his autonomy and freedom of action. His black ships were drawn up on the beach like sleeping sea monsters, ready to carry his warriors into battle or provide escape if circumstances demanded retreat. The first encounters with Trojan forces confirmed everything that the oracles had predicted about Achilles' role in the coming conflict. His presence on the battlefield transformed ordinary skirmishes into devastating victories for the Greek cause. Enemy warriors who had never known defeats found themselves fleeing before a single man whose speed and strength seemed to transcend mortal limitations. The young hero's combat style was unlike anything previously seen in warfare. Where other fighters relied primarily on strength or technique, Achilles combined both with an instinctive understanding of battle that seemed almost supernatural. He could anticipate enemy movements, exploit weaknesses that other warriors couldn't perceive, and strike with a precision that made every blow count. But perhaps most remarkable was the effect his presence had on his own forces. Myrmidon warriors, who had always been competent fighters, became something approaching unstoppable under his leadership. They fought with a coordination and intensity that reflected their commander's own divine nature, as though his excellence somehow elevated everyone around him to previously unimaginable levels of performance. The psychological impact on Trojan morale was immediate and devastating. Stories spread throughout the city of the Greek warrior who fought like a god made flesh, whose spear never missed its target, and whose shield never yielded to enemy weapons. Parents used his name to frighten disobedient children, while Trojan soldiers whispered prayers to their gods for protection from his terrible wrath. Yet even as his reputation grew with each passing battle, Achilles found himself increasingly frustrated by the constraints of siege warfare. The mighty walls of Troy had stood for generations, their massive stones fitted together with such skill that they seemed to grow from the earth itself. Taking such fortifications would require patience and careful planning rather than the direct assault that suited his temperament and abilities. The siege settled into a pattern that would define the next several years of conflict. Days of savage fighting, alternated with periods of relative calm, as both sides probed for weaknesses while building their strength for the decisive battles that everyone knew must eventually come. The Greek camp became a permanent fixture on the Trojan plain, its population swelling with reinforcements and supplies from across the Aegean. During the quieter periods, Achilles devoted himself to training and preparation with an intensity that impressed even his most dedicated followers. He understood that the Trojans would eventually find champions capable of matching his abilities, warriors whose skill and courage might pose genuine threats to his dominance of the battlefield. When that time came, he intended to be ready. The bonds between Achilles and Patroclus deepened during these months of shared danger and triumph. They fought side by side in every major engagement, their coordination so perfect that they seemed to anticipate each other's thoughts and movements. Other warriors spoke of them with a mixture of admiration and envy, recognizing a partnership that transcended ordinary human relationships. In the quiet hours between battles, they would sit together outside their tent, sharing thoughts and memories while gazing across the plain toward the distant walls of Troy. Both understood that their greatest trials still lay ahead, that the prophecies surrounding Achilles' fate had yet to be fulfilled. But they also knew that whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together, bound by loyalty stronger than bronze and deeper than the wine-dark sea. As the first year of siege drew to a close, the pattern of conflict had established itself with grim clarity. The Greeks commanded the plain and controlled the sea, but the walls of Troy remained intact, sheltering a population that showed no signs of surrender. This would be a war of attrition rather than decisive victory, a grinding test of endurance that would ultimately be won by whichever side could maintain its will to fight longer than its enemies. For Achilles, this realization brought both anticipation and a strange sort of peace. The glory he had been promised would come, but it would be earned through years of struggle rather than won in a single climactic battle. The thread of his fate was unwinding exactly as the prophecies had foretold, leading him step by inevitable step toward the moment when his name would be written in immortal song, purchased with the currency of his own mortal life. The greatest warrior who ever lived had found his war, and that war would define not only his own destiny, but the fate of two civilizations locked in a struggle that would echo through the ages, long after the last sword was sheathed and the final hero had fallen. The second year of the siege brought with it a rhythm of warfare that would have broken lesser men, but for Achilles it represented the gradual fulfillment of everything he had been shaped to become. The endless cycle of battle, victory, and temporary respite created a crucible in which his already extraordinary abilities were refined to perfection. Each engagement taught him something new about the art of war. Each fallen enemy added another layer to his growing legend. The Trojan champions, who rode out to meet him in single combat, were brave men, skilled warriors who had earned their reputations through years of successful battle. Yet one by one, they fell before his bronze-tipped spear, their courage proving insufficient against abilities that transcended mortal limitations. With each victory, Achilles felt himself drawing closer to the destiny that had been written in the stars before his birth. The psychological effect of these repeated triumphs rippled through both armies, like waves spreading from a stone cast into still water. Greek warriors who had initially viewed the young hero with skeptical curiosity now regarded him with something approaching religious awe. They had witnessed feats that seemed to violate the natural laws governing human capability, seen their commander accomplish things that belonged in the realm of myth rather than reality. Among the Trojans, Achilles had become a figure of nightmare, a demon whose very name could empty entire sections of the battlefield. Parents in the city told stories of the golden-haired destroyer who stalked the plain beyond their walls, seeking whom he might devour. Children woke screaming from dreams, where bronze spears flashed like lightning and war cries echoed like thunder from the throat of an avenging god. Yet for all his martial success, Achilles found himself grappling with emotions and desires that his training under Chiron had never fully prepared him to understand. The constant proximity to death, the responsibility for the lives of his men, the weight of expectations from both mortal commanders and immortal observers, all combined to create pressures that tested even his divine heritage. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the camp lay wrapped in the peaceful embrace of exhausted sleep, Achilles would often walk alone among his ships, his thoughts turning to the path that had brought him to this place. The boy who had once raced through mountain meadows with Patroclus seemed like a figure from another lifetime, innocent of the complexities that now defined his existence. The letters that arrived from Skyros brought news that stirred feelings he had thought safely buried beneath the demands of warfare. Deidamia had given birth to a son, a child who would carry Achilles' blood but grow up never knowing his father's touch. The young hero read these messages with emotions too complex to untangle, joy and sorrow intertwining like the threads of some cosmic tapestry. His son would bear the name Neoptolemus, and the reports described a child who already showed signs of the extraordinary heritage flowing through his veins. Even as an infant, he displayed strength and alertness that surpassed normal human development. Achilles found himself wondering what kind of man this child would become, whether he would inherit not only divine gifts, but also the terrible burden of prophecy that shaped his father's existence. The knowledge that his bloodline would continue brought a strange comfort to Achilles as he contemplated the fate that awaited him. Death might claim his body, but something of his essence would survive in his son, perhaps free from the constraints of destiny that had bound his own life so completely. The boy might achieve the peaceful existence that circumstances had denied his father. Patroclus served as both confidant and counselor during these periods of introspection, his gentle wisdom providing balance to Achilles' more volatile nature. Their conversations ranged across every aspect of their shared experience, from tactical discussions about upcoming battles to philosophical reflections on the meaning of heroism and the price of glory. The bond between them had evolved into something that transcended ordinary friendship, approaching the sacred relationship that existed between heroes of legend. They shared not only common purpose, but genuine understanding of each other's deepest thoughts and fears. In a world where death lurked behind every bronze spear point, their mutual loyalty provided an anchor of stability that kept both men grounded amid the chaos of war. As the siege progressed, Achilles began to encounter opponents whose skill approached his own supernatural abilities. These were not ordinary Trojan soldiers, but champions whose own divine heritage or exceptional training made them genuinely dangerous adversaries. The battles with these elite warriors tested every aspect of his combat prowess, forcing him to draw upon reserves of strength and cunning that he had never previously needed to access. One such encounter occurred during a Greek assault on a Trojan outpost that controlled access to fresh water sources. The defending commander was Cycnus, a son of Poseidon, whose divine parentage had granted him skin that no ordinary weapon could penetrate. The battle between these two superhuman warriors raged across the contested ground for hours, their bronze weapons ringing against each other with sounds like temple bells calling mortals to worship. Achilles discovered that his usual tactics proved ineffective against an opponent who could ignore wounds that would have felled any mortal man. Cycnus fought with the confidence of someone who had never experienced vulnerability, his attacks growing bolder as he realized that the legendary Greek hero could not harm him through conventional means. The struggle became a test of endurance and ingenuity rather than simple martial skill. The resolution came when Achilles remembered lessons learned during his training with Chiron, techniques for combat that went beyond mere weapon work. Instead of attempting to pierce Cycnus's invulnerable skin, he focused on using the Trojan's own divine strength against him. A perfectly timed throw sent his opponent crashing into a rocky outcropping with such force that internal injuries proved fatal despite external invulnerability. Victory over such a formidable opponent enhanced Achilles' reputation even further, but it also served as a reminder that his enemies were adapting to his presence on the battlefield. The Trojans were seeking champions who might match his abilities, warriors whose own supernatural gifts could neutralize his advantages. The war was escalating beyond ordinary human conflict into something approaching a battle between gods. The third year of siege brought changes that would reshape the entire character of the conflict. Trojan resistance had stiffened as their initial shock at Greek capabilities gave way to grim determination to defend their homeland. New alliances brought fresh forces to support the defenders, while innovative tactics began to challenge Greek assumptions about how the war would unfold. Among these new developments, none was more significant than the arrival of foreign champions whose reputations rivaled those of the greatest Greek heroes. Warriors from distant lands brought exotic fighting techniques and supernatural abilities that had never been seen in Mediterranean warfare. The siege was becoming a gathering of the greatest fighters from across the known world. Achilles met each new challenge with enthusiasm that bordered on joy, recognizing that worthy opponents would provide the tests necessary to forge his abilities to their ultimate potential. The prophecies had promised him glory beyond imagination, but such glory could only be earned through trials that pushed him to the very limits of his divine heritage. The battles with these elite opponents became legendary events that warriors would recount for generations to come. Each encounter was unique, requiring different strategies and revealing new aspects of Achilles' incredible versatility as a fighter. He proved equally deadly with spear and sword, equally effective in single combat or leading mass formations, equally dangerous on foot or fighting from a chariot. But perhaps most remarkable was his ability to inspire those who fought alongside him. Ordinary Myrmidon warriors became heroes in their own right when fighting under his leadership, their own capabilities somehow elevated by proximity to his excellence. The entire Greek army began to develop a confidence and aggressiveness that reflected their champion's invincible spirit. The psychological warfare that accompanied these martial victories proved almost as devastating as the physical damage inflicted on Trojan forces. Stories of Achilles' latest triumphs spread throughout the besieged city, undermining morale and creating an atmosphere of fatalistic despair among defenders who had initially believed their walls made them invincible. Yet even as external victories mounted, Achilles found himself facing internal challenges that threatened to overwhelm his emotional equilibrium. The constant presence of death, the weight of command, the knowledge of his approaching fate, all combined to create pressures that tested the limits of even his supernatural resilience. Dreams began to trouble his sleep, visions that seemed to offer glimpses of possible futures or warnings about dangers yet to come. He would wake from these nocturnal journeys with fragments of images burning in his memory, scenes of battles not yet fought and consequences not yet faced. His divine heritage was manifesting in ways that went beyond physical prowess to include prophetic insights that both guided and tormented him. The relationship with his immortal mother became increasingly complex as Thetis began appearing to him more frequently, her visits bringing both comfort and additional burden. She could see the threads of fate weaving toward their inevitable conclusion, and her attempts to prepare him for what was coming sometimes revealed more than Achilles wished to know about his approaching destiny. These conversations with Thetis provided crucial insights into the cosmic forces that were shaping the war's progression. The conflict at Troy had become something far more significant than a dispute between mortal kingdoms. Divine powers were aligning themselves with different sides, transforming the siege into a contest that would determine the future balance between gods and men. The young hero learned that his own role in these larger machinations was more complex than he had previously understood. His success on the battlefield was not merely personal achievement, but was advancing causes that extended far beyond the immediate military objectives of the Greek expedition. Every Trojan champion he defeated weakened the forces of an older divine order that some gods sought to preserve. This knowledge brought both pride and a strange sort of melancholy to Achilles as he contemplated the scope of his involvement in cosmic affairs. He was not simply fighting for Greek victory or personal glory, but was serving as an instrument of change that would reshape the relationship between mortal and divine realms for generations to come. The fourth year of the siege dawned with omens that even the most skeptical warriors could not ignore. Eagles soared in patterns that seemed to spell out messages in the ancient script of divine communication. The sea took on colors that had never been witnessed before, while the very air seemed to vibrate with energies that made mortal skin tingle with anticipation. Achilles felt these cosmic stirrings more intensely than anyone else in the Greek camp, his divine heritage making him sensitive to forces that remained invisible to purely human perception. He knew with certainty that the war was approaching some crucial turning point, a moment when all the threads of fate that had been slowly weaving together would finally create the pattern that had been destined from the beginning. The preparation for whatever was coming involved not just military planning, but spiritual readiness for trials that would test every aspect of his nature. He spent long hours in meditation and prayer, seeking guidance from both his immortal mother and the shade of his beloved mentor Chiron. The wisdom gained from these communications would prove essential in the challenges that lay ahead. As spring gave way to summer in that fateful fourth year, Achilles stood once again on the shore of the wine-dark sea, gazing toward the distant walls of Troy. The young man who had departed Skyros with dreams of glory had been transformed by years of warfare into something approaching a force of nature, a warrior whose very presence could alter the course of battles and the fate of nations. But the greatest trials still lay ahead, waiting in the shadows of a destiny that would soon unfold with all the terrible inevitability of a thunderstorm building on the horizon. The threads of prophecy were drawing tight, and the moment was approaching when Achilles would face the choice that would define not only his own legacy, but the ultimate outcome of the greatest war the world had ever known. The threads of destiny began to pull tighter as the fourth year of siege progressed into its most fateful season. Achilles could feel something fundamental shifting in the very fabric of the war itself, as though the gods were preparing to intervene directly in mortal affairs. The air around Troy grew thick with tension that had nothing to do with the approaching summer heat, and even the most battle-hardened veterans spoke in hushed whispers about portents they had witnessed but could not fully understand. In the Trojan camp, similar stirrings were taking place as Prince Hector, Troy's greatest defender, began to experience his own prophetic dreams. The noble son of King Priam had long served as the backbone of Trojan resistance, his courage and tactical brilliance holding the Greek forces at bay despite their overwhelming advantages. But now he found himself haunted by visions of a golden-haired destroyer whose coming would herald the end of everything he held dear. The two greatest warriors of their respective sides had not yet met in single combat, though both understood that such an encounter was inevitable. Their armies had clashed countless times, but fate seemed determined to preserve both champions for a confrontation that would surpass all previous battles in its significance. When that moment arrived, the very foundations of the ancient world would tremble beneath the force of their collision. Meanwhile, changes were occurring within the Greek camp that reflected the growing tensions between powerful personalities who had been forced to cooperate for years, despite fundamental differences in temperament and philosophy. Agamemnon's authority as overall commander remained unchallenged in practical terms, but his relationship with Achilles had grown increasingly strained as the young hero's reputation eclipsed that of every other Greek leader. The source of these tensions lay not in any single incident, but in the accumulated weight of countless small conflicts over strategy, honor, and the distribution of captured wealth. Achilles had always maintained a certain independence from the formal command structure, justified by his divine heritage and supernatural abilities. This autonomy had been tolerated when victories came easily, but as the siege dragged on without decisive resolution, questions began to arise about unity of command and proper military hierarchy. The situation was further complicated by the arrival of new Greek reinforcements, including heroes whose own reputations had been earned in distant campaigns and who possessed their own ideas about how the war should be conducted. These late arrivals brought fresh energy to the Greek cause, but they also introduced new personalities and perspectives that disrupted the delicate balance that had previously held the alliance together. Among these newcomers was Neoptolemus, though he remained on distant Skyros, still too young to participate in warfare, but already showing signs of the extraordinary heritage that flowed through his veins. Reports reached Achilles describing a boy whose strength and intelligence far exceeded normal human development, whose very presence seemed to inspire confidence in those around him. The knowledge that his son was growing into someone worthy of the family legacy brought both joy and melancholy to the absent father. The correspondence between Achilles and those who cared for his son became one of his few sources of purely personal happiness during these increasingly difficult months. Letters from Skyros described a child who possessed his father's courage and his mother's gentle wisdom, a combination that suggested he might achieve the balanced life that circumstances had denied to previous generations of heroes. But even these moments of private joy were shadowed by the knowledge that Neoptolemus would grow up without ever knowing his father's direct influence. The boy would inherit a name made glorious through warfare, but he would also bear the burden of living up to achievements that might prove impossible to match or surpass. Such were the complexities that accompanied divine heritage in a world where gods and mortals shared the stage of existence. As summer deepened, the frequency of significant battles increased dramatically, as though both sides understood instinctively that the time for decisive action was approaching. These engagements took on a character different from earlier conflicts, marked by a desperation and intensity that reflected the accumulated frustrations of years of inconclusive warfare. Achilles found himself at the center of nearly every major encounter, his presence on the battlefield serving as both inspiration to his own forces and a source of terror to Trojan defenders. His combat skills had been honed to perfection through years of constant warfare, every movement precise and economical, every strike calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum effort. The bronze armor he wore had become legendary in its own right, its gleaming surface reflecting sunlight in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic to those who witnessed his approach across contested ground. The shield bore images that told the story of his divine heritage, while his spear had acquired a reputation for never missing its intended target, no matter how skilled or elusive the enemy might be. But beyond his personal equipment and individual prowess, Achilles had developed into something even more dangerous, a complete military commander whose strategic vision could shape entire campaigns. His understanding of battlefield tactics had evolved to encompass not just personal combat, but the coordination of large formations, the exploitation of terrain advantages, and the psychological manipulation of enemy morale. The Myrmidons who served under his direct command had been transformed through years of shared combat into something approaching a supernatural fighting force. Their discipline, courage, and tactical flexibility reflected their commander's own excellence, while their loyalty to him had deepened into something that transcended ordinary military relationships. They would have followed Achilles into the underworld itself if he had commanded such a journey. This transformation of ordinary warriors into legendary fighters, demonstrated one of Achilles' most remarkable qualities, his ability to inspire others to achieve levels of performance they had never imagined possible. His very presence seemed to elevate everyone around him, as though his divine nature somehow infected those who served alongside him with a portions of his own extraordinary capabilities. The effect extended beyond his immediate followers to influence the entire Greek army, whose confidence and aggressiveness had grown steadily during the years of Achilles' dominance on the battlefield. Warriors who had initially viewed the siege as a difficult but achievable goal now spoke of inevitable victory with a certainty that reflected their champion's invincible reputation. Yet even as external victories mounted and his legend continued to grow, Achilles found himself grappling with internal conflicts that threatened to overwhelm his emotional equilibrium. The constant presence of death, the weight of command, the knowledge of his approaching fate, all combined to create pressures that tested the limits of even his supernatural resilience. The dreams that had begun to trouble his sleep during earlier years of the siege now came with increasing frequency and intensity. Visions that seemed to offer glimpses of possible futures or warnings about dangers yet to come. He would wake from these nocturnal journeys with fragments of images burning in his memory, scenes of battles not yet fought and consequences not yet faced. Some of these dreams featured Patroclus in circumstances that filled Achilles with inexplicable dread, though he could never quite remember enough detail upon waking to understand why these visions affected him so powerfully. His closest friend appeared in scenarios that suggested danger and loss, but the specific nature of the threats remained frustratingly vague. The relationship between the two heroes had continued to deepen during their shared years of warfare, their bond becoming something that transcended ordinary human friendship to approach the sacred partnerships celebrated in ancient songs. They fought together, planned together, shared their deepest thoughts and fears, and provided each other with the emotional support necessary to endure the psychological stresses of prolonged combat. Patroclus had evolved from the gentle companion of their youth into a formidable warrior in his own right, though he remained overshadowed by Achilles' supernatural abilities. His tactical insights and diplomatic skills had proved invaluable in managing the complex relationships within the Greek alliance, while his calming influence provided essential balance to Achilles' more volatile temperament. The contrast between their personalities had become even more pronounced during the years of siege, with Patroclus developing into a voice of moderation and careful consideration, while Achilles burned ever brighter with divine fire. This complementary relationship had served them well, but it also created dependencies that would prove dangerous if circumstances ever forced them apart. As autumn approached and the siege entered its 5th year, both men could sense that their partnership was approaching some crucial test, though neither could articulate exactly what form that challenge might take. The prophecies that had shaped Achilles' entire existence spoke of glory and death, but they remained frustratingly vague about the specific sequence of events that would lead to their fulfillment. The arrival of new Trojan allies during this period introduced fresh complications to a conflict that had already grown far beyond its original scope. Warriors from distant kingdoms brought exotic fighting techniques and supernatural abilities that had never before been seen in Mediterranean warfare, transforming the siege into a gathering of the greatest fighters from across the known world. Among these foreign champions, none was more significant than Memnon, son of the dawn goddess Eos, whose divine heritage rivaled Achilles' own supernatural gifts. The Ethiopian prince commanded forces whose discipline and effectiveness matched those of the legendary Myrmidons, while his personal combat abilities approached the level of the greatest Greek heroes. The anticipation surrounding a potential battle between Achilles and Memnon created an atmosphere of electric tension throughout both camps, as warriors on both sides recognized that such an encounter would represent a clash between forces that transcended ordinary human conflict. The outcome would determine not just military advantage, but would serve as a test of the relative power of different divine bloodlines. When the battle finally came, it exceeded even the most extravagant expectations of those who witnessed it. The two superhuman warriors fought across the contested plain for hours, their bronze weapons creating sparks that seemed to ignite the very air around them. Every clash of spear against shield sent shockwaves through the earth beneath their feet, while their war cries echoed like thunder from the walls of Troy. The combat was so evenly matched that neither warrior could gain a decisive advantage through conventional means. Both possessed strength that exceeded mortal limitations, speed that made their movements blur in the eyes of ordinary observers, and skills that had been honed through years of constant warfare against the greatest opponents their respective sides could provide. The resolution came only when Achilles managed to exploit a momentary opening in Memnon's defense, his spear finding the single vulnerable spot in armor that had been forged by divine smiths. The Ethiopian prince fell with honor, his death marking not just a personal victory for Achilles, but a symbolic triumph of Greek divine heritage over foreign supernatural power. Yet even in victory, Achilles felt no satisfaction, only a strange emptiness that seemed to grow larger with each fallen opponent. The glory that had once seemed so appealing now felt hollow, purchased at the cost of lives that might have been lived in peace if different choices had been made years earlier. The young hero was beginning to understand that fame earned through violence carried its own form of curse. The psychological weight of accumulated victories began to manifest in ways that concerned even his closest companions. Achilles grew increasingly isolated, spending long hours alone with his thoughts, wrestling with questions about the ultimate meaning of his existence and the price that others were paying for his immortal reputation. Patroclus watched these changes with growing alarm, recognizing that his friend was struggling with burdens that went beyond the normal stresses of command and combat. The gentle hero attempted to provide comfort and perspective, but he found it increasingly difficult to reach through the barriers that Achilles was unconsciously constructing around his innermost thoughts and feelings. The correspondence with Skyros provided some relief from these darker moods, bringing news of Neoptolemus's continued development and reminders of life beyond the endless cycle of warfare. The boy was growing into someone who combined his father's courage with his mother's wisdom, suggesting that he might achieve the balanced existence that circumstances had denied to his heroic parent. But even these glimpses of hope were shadowed by the knowledge that Achilles would likely never have the opportunity to guide his son's development personally. The threads of fate were drawing ever tighter, and the moment was approaching when the choices made years earlier would demand their final payment. The 5th year of siege was drawing toward its climactic conclusion, and with it would come the events that would transform the entire character of the war. The greatest trials still lay ahead, waiting in the shadows of a destiny that had been written in the stars before Achilles' birth, a fate that would soon unfold with all the terrible inevitability of a storm breaking over the wine-dark sea. The winter that followed Memnon's death brought an unexpected lull to the siege, as though the very gods needed time to recover from the supernatural violence they had witnessed. Snow fell upon the Trojan plain for the first time in living memory, blanketing both camps in pristine white that transformed the battlefield into something resembling a peaceful meadow rather than ground soaked with the blood of heroes. During these quiet months, Achilles found himself confronting emotions and memories that the constant demands of warfare had previously kept buried beneath layers of duty and action. The enforced inactivity allowed thoughts to surface that he had not permitted himself to examine during the years of relentless combat. Questions about the path he had chosen, the lives he had taken, and the ultimate purpose of his existence pressed upon his consciousness with increasing insistence. The letters from Skyros became his primary connection to a world beyond violence and death. Neoptolemus had reached his 7th year, and the reports described a child whose extraordinary development continued to amaze those responsible for his education. The boy could already outrun grown men, demonstrated strength that seemed impossible for his age, and showed tactical understanding that suggested an inherited genius for warfare. More importantly, young Neoptolemus displayed qualities of character that filled his absent father with both pride and melancholy. Despite his supernatural gifts, the child showed remarkable gentleness toward those weaker than himself, protecting smaller children from bullies and showing kindness to servants and slaves. His mother's influence was clearly shaping him into someone who might wield great power with wisdom and restraint. The contrast between his son's peaceful childhood and his own youth, spent learning the arts of war under Chiron's guidance, created complex feelings in Achilles' heart. He found himself wondering whether Neoptolemus might escape the cycle of violence that had defined every generation of their family, whether divine gifts might finally be used for creation rather than destruction. These reflections were interrupted by the arrival of disturbing news from the wider world beyond Troy. Other conflicts were erupting across the Greek territories, suggesting that the extended absence of so many heroes and warriors was creating opportunities for enemies who had previously been held in check by fear of retaliation. The siege that had begun as a response to Trojan aggression was now weakening Greece itself. King Peleus, growing old and increasingly frail, faced challenges to his authority from ambitious neighbors who believed his kingdom vulnerable without its prince's protection. The Myrmidons who had remained in Thessaly were valiant fighters, but they lacked the supernatural presence that had made their forces legendary throughout the ancient world. Reports reached Achilles describing border raids, diplomatic challenges, and internal unrest that threatened to fragment the very kingdom he was destined to inherit. His father's letters, though carefully worded to avoid seeming critical of his son's choices, clearly conveyed the growing difficulties facing their homeland during his prolonged absence. The young hero found himself caught between conflicting loyalties and responsibilities that seemed impossible to reconcile. His duty to the Greek cause demanded his continued presence at Troy, where his supernatural abilities remained essential for ultimate victory. Yet his obligations as a son and future king called him home to defend the realm that had shaped his earliest years. Patroclus served as both confidant and counselor during these difficult months, his wisdom and emotional support providing the stability that Achilles needed to navigate the increasingly complex challenges he faced. Their conversations ranged across every aspect of their shared experience, from tactical discussions about the siege's progress to philosophical reflections on the meaning of heroism and the price of immortal fame. The bond between them had evolved into something that transcended ordinary friendship, approaching the sacred relationships celebrated in the oldest songs and stories. They had shared dangers that would have broken ordinary men, witnessed horrors that haunted their dreams, and achieved victories that would be remembered for generations to come. Yet even this deepest of friendships could not completely shield Achilles from the growing weight of isolation that accompanied his supernatural status. The divine blood flowing through his veins set him apart from other mortals in ways that became more pronounced with each passing year. Other heroes might achieve great deeds through courage and skill, but they remained fundamentally human in their limitations and vulnerabilities. Achilles existed in a space between mortal and divine realms, too human to claim a place among the gods, yet too touched by divinity to find complete companionship among men. This essential loneliness had grown more acute during the years of siege, as the deaths of worthy opponents removed the few individuals who could challenge him on equal terms. The dreams that had troubled his sleep during earlier phases of the war now came with prophetic clarity that left no doubt about their divine origin. He saw visions of battles yet to be fought, champions yet to be faced, and consequences that extended far beyond the immediate conflict at Troy. Most disturbing were recurring images of Patroclus in circumstances that filled him with inexplicable dread. These nocturnal visions featured his closest friend wearing Achilles' own armor, leading Myrmidon forces into combat against overwhelming odds. The dreams always ended at the moment of greatest danger, leaving Achilles to wake in cold sweat without knowing whether the scenes represented prophecy, warning, or merely the product of his own fears and anxieties. His attempts to discuss these dreams with Patroclus met with gentle reassurance and logical explanations that provided little comfort. His friend argued that years of warfare naturally produce disturbing dreams, that the stresses of command and the weight of responsibility inevitably manifested in psychological ways. Such reasoning made perfect sense, yet failed to address the supernatural clarity and consistency of the visions. The winter months also brought visits from Thetis, who emerged from her undersea kingdom to spend time with her son during the rare periods when divine politics allowed such maternal attention. These encounters provided comfort and guidance, but they also served as reminders of the cosmic forces that continued to shape his destiny according to patterns beyond mortal understanding. Through these conversations, Achilles learned that the war at Troy had become something far more significant than a simple conflict between human kingdoms. Divine powers throughout the ancient world were watching the siege's progress, understanding that its ultimate resolution would establish precedents affecting the future relationship between gods and mortals for centuries to come. His own role in these larger machinations was more complex than he had previously understood. Every victory on the battlefield advanced causes that extended far beyond immediate military objectives, while every fallen enemy represented a small victory for newer divine orders over more ancient powers. The blood he spilled with his bronze spear was helping to write the future history of the cosmos itself. This knowledge brought both pride and burden to Achilles, as he contemplated the true scope of his involvement in affairs that transcended individual human concerns. He was not simply fighting for Greek victory or personal glory, but was serving as an instrument of change that would reshape fundamental aspects of reality for generations yet unborn. The responsibility was immense, yet it also provided meaning that helped justify the violence and loss that had characterized his existence since departing Skyros years earlier. If his actions were contributing to some greater cosmic purpose, perhaps the deaths he had caused and the lives he had taken served ends that transcended individual tragedy. As winter gave way to spring and the siege entered its 6th year, both armies prepared for what many sensed would be the final phase of their long struggle. The extended conflict had tested every aspect of their respective capabilities, eliminating weaknesses and revealing strengths that might otherwise have remained hidden. The forces that would face each other in the coming battles had been forged through years of trial into instruments of warfare that surpassed anything previously seen in human history. The Greek camp had evolved into a permanent military city whose organization and efficiency reflected years of accumulated experience in conducting large-scale operations. Supply lines stretched across the Aegean to every corner of the Greek world, while diplomatic networks maintained the complex alliances necessary to sustain such an extended campaign. Within this sophisticated military machine, Achilles had established himself as something approaching a force of nature, a warrior whose very presence could alter the course of battles and the fate of nations. His myrmidons had been transformed through shared combat into a fighting force whose discipline and effectiveness had become legendary throughout the ancient world. Yet even as external preparations reached their peak, internal tensions within the Greek alliance were approaching a crisis that would test the very foundations of their cooperative effort. The prolonged siege had strained relationships between powerful personalities who had been forced to work together despite fundamental differences in temperament and philosophy. Agamemnon's authority as overall commander remained unchallenged in formal terms, but his relationship with Achilles had grown increasingly problematic as the young hero's reputation eclipsed that of every other Greek leader. The distribution of captured wealth, the assignment of military objectives, and countless smaller decisions had created accumulated resentments that threatened to explode into open conflict. The situation was further complicated by the arrival of new intelligence about Trojan preparations for what appeared to be a final, desperate attempt to break the Greek siege through decisive military action. Prince Hector was reportedly organizing a massive assault that would commit Troy's remaining reserves in an all-or-nothing gamble to drive the invaders back into the sea. This development created both opportunity and danger for the Greek cause. A successful defense against such an attack would likely break Trojan resistance permanently, opening the way for final victory. But failure to contain Hector's assault could result in catastrophic losses that would force the Greeks to abandon their long investment in the siege. The strategic planning required to meet this threat demanded unprecedented cooperation between Greek commanders who had grown increasingly suspicious of each other's motives and methods. Achilles found himself at the center of these discussions, his tactical brilliance essential for developing effective countermeasures, yet his independent nature creating friction with those who sought to maintain traditional command hierarchies. The debates that took place in Agamemnon's tent during those crucial weeks would be remembered by participants for the rest of their lives. Every aspect of Greek strategy was examined and re-examined, every possible contingency discussed and prepared for, every resource cataloged and allocated according to its potential contribution to the coming battle. Yet beneath these practical considerations lay deeper questions about leadership, authority, and the proper relationship between individual excellence and collective responsibility. Achilles' supernatural abilities made him indispensable, but they also created challenges for commanders who were accustomed to more predictable forms of military cooperation. The young hero's growing impatience with what he perceived as unnecessary constraints on his freedom of action reflected not arrogance, but frustration with inefficiencies that might prove costly when lives hung in the balance. His divine heritage provided insights into enemy intentions and battlefield dynamics that purely human commanders could not match, yet translating those insights into effective action required trust and flexibility that some leaders found difficult to provide. As spring advanced towards summer and Trojan preparations became increasingly obvious, the pressure to resolve these internal conflicts grew more intense. The greatest battle of the war was approaching, and Greek victory would depend not just on individual heroism, but on their ability to function as a unified force capable of coordinating complex military operations under extreme stress. Achilles spent long hours during this period in consultation with Patroclus, refining their understanding of both the tactical challenges they would face and the political complexities that might constrain their response options. Their friendship provided a foundation of trust and mutual understanding that would prove essential in the trials ahead. The conversations between them during those fateful weeks ranged across every aspect of their shared experience, from childhood memories of training under Chiron to speculation about the battles yet to come. Both men understood that they were approaching a crucial test that would determine not only the war's outcome, but their own destinies as heroes whose deeds would echo through the ages. The threads of fate were drawing tighter with each passing day, and the moment was approaching when years of preparation and accumulated experience would be tested in the crucible of decisive combat. The greatest warrior who ever lived was about to face the challenges that would either confirm his legendary status or reveal the limitations that even divine heritage could not overcome. The wine-dark sea continued its eternal rhythm against the Trojan shore, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding upon its beaches, yet somehow serving as witness to events that would reshape the ancient world and establish patterns of heroism that would inspire countless generations yet to come. The dawn of what would prove to be the most decisive day in the entire siege broke with omens that even the most skeptical warriors could not dismiss. The sun rose blood red over the Trojan plain, its crimson light transforming the morning mist into what appeared to be rivers of fire flowing between the opposing camps. Birds that normally filled the air with their songs remained silent, as though nature itself held its breath in anticipation of the violence to come. Achilles stood at the prow of his black ship, watching the eastern horizon bloom with colors that seemed to mirror the divine fire burning within his own breast. The dreams that had haunted his sleep through the long winter months had reached a crescendo of clarity and intensity, leaving him with absolute certainty that this day would bring events that would alter the course of his destiny forever. The threads of fate that had been weaving through his entire existence were finally converging into the pattern that had been ordained before his birth. The young hero's divine senses could perceive stirrings in the spiritual realm that remained invisible to purely mortal observers. The very air around Troy seemed to vibrate with energies that spoke of divine intervention on a scale that had not been witnessed since the Titanomachy itself. Gaze who had maintained careful neutrality throughout the siege were choosing sides with a finality that suggested the outcome would determine cosmic balances for ages to come. Patroclus joined his friend at the ship's rail, his presence bringing the steady comfort that had sustained both men through years of shared trials and triumphs. The gentle hero possessed an intuitive understanding of his companion's moods that transcended ordinary friendship, and he could see in Achilles' bearing the weight of knowledge that came from sources beyond human understanding. Their conversation that morning covered practical matters of military preparation, but underneath the discussion of weapons and tactics lay deeper currents of emotion that neither man felt ready to address directly. Both understood that the coming battle would test not only their martial skills, but the very foundations of their partnership, though the specific nature of that test remained frustratingly unclear. The Myrmidon forces began their morning preparations with the disciplined efficiency that had made them legendary throughout the Greek world. These warriors had been forged through years of combat under Achilles' leadership into something approaching a supernatural fighting force, their movements coordinated with precision that seemed almost telepathic. Each man knew his role in the complex battle formations they had perfected through countless engagements, yet all remained flexible enough to adapt to whatever challenges the day might bring. The bronze armor that gleamed in the early sunlight represented the finest craftsmanship available to the ancient world, much of it enhanced through divine intervention or blessed by gods who favored the Greek cause. Shields bore images that told stories of heroic deeds and divine favor, while spears had been balanced to achieve perfect harmony between striking power and throwing accuracy. Every piece of equipment reflected years of accumulated experience about what worked best in the chaos of ancient warfare. Yet for all their material preparation, the most important element of Myrmidon readiness lay in their absolute faith in their commander's invincibility. These men had witnessed Achilles perform feats that seemed to violate natural law, had seen him emerge victorious from encounters that should have been impossible to survive. Their confidence in ultimate victory was not based on tactical analysis or strategic assessment, but on religious certainty that their leader possessed divine protection that could overcome any earthly opposition. The intelligence reports that reached the Greek camp throughout the morning painted a picture of Trojan preparations that exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates of enemy capability. Prince Hector had indeed committed every available resource to this final assault, gathering forces from across the Trojan alliance for what appeared to be a desperate gamble to break the siege through sheer, overwhelming force. The enemy formations assembling beyond the city walls included not only Troy's finest warriors, but contingents from every kingdom and city-state that had allied itself with Priam's cause. Ethiopian spearmen whose bronze points had been blessed by foreign gods marched alongside Thracian cavalry, whose horses seemed to breathe fire in the morning chill. Amazon warriors, whose skill with bow and spear rivaled that of the greatest male heroes, prepared to fight beside Lycian swordsmen, whose blades had been forged in volcanic fires. Most ominous of all were reports of champions whose individual reputations approached those of the greatest Greek heroes. These were not ordinary soldiers, but elite fighters whose supernatural abilities had been earned through divine favor, years of training, or mysterious rituals that granted powers beyond mortal limitations. The coming battle would pit the finest warriors of two civilizations against each other in combat that would determine not just military victory, but the future balance of power throughout the ancient world. Agamemnon called a final council of war as the sun reached its zenith, gathering the Greek commanders in his tent for last-minute coordination of their response to the Trojan threat. The atmosphere was tense, with barely controlled emotions, as powerful personalities who had been forced to cooperate for years, despite fundamental differences, prepared to commit everything to the coming engagement. The overall commander's plan was sound in its broad outlines, calling for coordinated defensive actions that would channel Trojan attacks into killing zones where Greek advantages in equipment and training could be maximized. The various contingents would maintain their assigned positions until enemy momentum was broken, then launch counterattacks designed to exploit whatever weaknesses the assault revealed in Trojan formations. Achilles listened to these deliberations with growing impatience that reflected not arrogance, but frustration with strategic thinking that failed to account for the supernatural elements that would inevitably shape the battle's outcome. His divine heritage provided insights into enemy capabilities and intentions that purely human analysis could not match. Yet translating those insights into effective tactical adjustments required flexibility that traditional military thinking found difficult to accommodate. The young hero's suggestions for modifications to the battle plan were tactically brilliant but politically problematic, requiring levels of trust and autonomy that some commanders found difficult to grant. His request for permission to operate independently with his Myrmidon forces, striking at targets of opportunity as the battle developed, challenged conventional notions of unified command and coordinated action. The debate that followed revealed the fundamental tensions that had been building within the Greek alliance throughout the years of siege. Questions of individual excellence versus collective responsibility, divine favor versus human effort, and traditional authority versus supernatural capability all came to the surface in discussions that grew increasingly heated as time grew short. The resolution came when reports arrived indicating that Trojan forces were already beginning to move toward their assault positions, making further debate impossible. Agamemnon granted Achilles the operational freedom he had requested, understanding that the young hero's unique abilities might prove decisive in the chaos of the coming battle. The decision was pragmatic rather than enthusiastic, but it provided the flexibility that would be essential for Greek survival. As the commanders dispersed to their final preparations, Achilles and Patroclus returned to their own camp for the personal rituals that would prepare them mentally and spiritually for the trials ahead. The young hero spent time in prayer and meditation, seeking guidance from both his immortal mother and the wisdom of his beloved mentor Chiron. The divine insights he received would prove crucial in the challenges that lay ahead. And so we reach the end of this timeless tale, though Achilles' story continues to unfold in the battles yet to come. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, let the echoes of bronze spears and the wine-dark sea carry you into dreams of ancient heroes. The greatest warrior who ever lived awaits his destiny, and his legend burns eternal in the stars above. Sleep well, and may your own dreams be filled with the courage of heroes.